According to Mark 7, verse 19, Jesus purified or cleansed all foods. What does that really mean? Welcome back to Digging Deeper, where we visit with prominent New Testament scholars about important issues in the Gospel of Mark. I'm Carl Cosart, the writer and host of Reliving Mark, Discovering Jesus in Israel. This is the third part of our four-part conversation with Dr. Mueller. Dr. Mueller, thank you again for joining us, and let's tackle this question. We've talked about it a lot, but we really haven't answered it yet. How do we understand this statement that Jesus purified all foods? What does that exactly mean?
This is indeed the riddle of the passage, this purifying all foods clause that is added in verse 19 of this chapter. And it is a befuddling and confusing phrase for many reasons, and I think that is part of the solution, not part of the problem. But for decades and centuries, people have studied this, and it is confusing because it is a participial clause, meaning it doesn't have a main verb and it doesn't have a subject. It is just a participle with an attachment, with an object, all foods, purifying all foods. And there's two questions that we need to ask. Number one, who is doing the action? And number two, what action is being done? What does it mean to cleanse and purify? Purify from what? So the first question is who's doing the action. The immediate context would say it might be the toilet, but that doesn't make any sense and doesn't match actually what is being said. The much better way is to see that Jesus is doing something. He's talking and he's presenting a point of view. He's explaining the parable that to his disciples that was unclear to the congregation in the whole. So the disciples ask in private, and now Jesus expands on this and explains what he means. But even that to Mark's readers is still unclear. So Mark adds a little attachment and he makes it as brief as possible to not interrupt the storyline. And he says, well, this means, dear audience, side note, explanatory phrase, this means that Jesus cleansed all foods. So that's what Mark is doing. And much like in the first part where we talked about Mark giving us a little background about what the practices were of the Jews of his time, washing the basins and the pots and pans, now he gives us an explanation of what Jesus did. Jesus cleansed all foods. And I think Mark in his interpretation is correct. We do have to explain two things. What is food? And also, what does it mean to cleanse? So now we get to that second question. What is food? All foods. Well, foods we need to consider is what a society deems to be edible. And that shifts from one part of the society to another part of the society. To use a example from my childhood, I would not consider a leather boot or leather shoe to be food. And yet, I remember growing up as a kid and seeing old Laurel and Hardy movies. These are two black and white actors, comedians, and they are in a western town and not watching what they're eating, and they eat a shoe. Well, this is comedy, this is humor, this is a television show, it's not reality. And so we immediately sense a leather shoe is not food. That's the whole point of this physical joke that is being done in this little movie clip. But even today, societies have different norms of what is food. In the Western world, we would never consider dogs and cats to be food, and yet in Asia there is no qualms about eating cats and dogs, and you can find street vendors that will prepare dog meat for people. Societies have different rules, so we need to understand what food is from that original society. And the original society that we're talking about here, Jesus is communicating to a Jewish audience. How did they understand it? Well, for them, the two hallmarks of being a Jew that were the visible hallmarks in everyday life were Sabbath observance and not eating unclean meats. And in fact, historians in the ancient world wrote largely about this. Those are the two hallmarks for a good believing Jew. And that's how you could identify. A Roman citizen could say, that's a Jew because he keeps Sabbath and he doesn't eat unclean meats. And so this was ingrained in the people. Leviticus 11 was ever present. It was one of the identifying marks for Jews in the larger community. So if Jesus wanted to change this obscure phrase is not sufficient to change a practice so ingrained in the identifying mark. And in fact, that the disciples didn't pick up on this seems to be an indication that they did not consider that Jesus had made this pronouncement. That would mean that now it is okay to eat unclean animals. That is not the sense. So what is food? Well, in this larger context, actually that includes even bread. The whole the passage before that is full of references to bread. There is the feeding of the 5,000, there's the feeding of the 4,000, there's the reference to sourdough, there's a feast in Herod's household, there's breadcrumbs and crumbs in the passage right after this, the Syrophoenician woman. The passage has been called the bread motif, and there are several chapters in this bread motif where we move from one passage to the next, and all of them around bread. This is food in general. It's not even talking about meat per se, it's just food. And bread is the largest, the most talked about food item in this whole context. And so what this reference to food is food from a Jewish perspective. Jews would have never considered unclean animals to be that. And this ambiguous passage actually makes it clear that what seems so obvious is not as obvious. The passage isn't clear, the phrase isn't clear, and here Jesus is not doing that. The solution why Mark added this phrase will now come as we explore what it means to purify.
Okay, that makes sense. So food doesn't mean anything. It means food from a Jewish perspective. So the food we're talking about is not unclean food, but clean food. But what about the second question? What was this category of clean food being cleansed from?
Well, for that we need to look at the whole context. In English, we use the term clean and unclean. And the difference between clean and unclean is a little prefix that we add to the word clean to make it mean the opposite, un. And we use a lot of different ones, legal and illegal, appropriate and disappropriate. We have these little prefixes that mean the opposite. And in fact, in Greek, it works the same way. Clean is katharitzo, that means I cleanse. And to make something unclean is akatharizo. So you just add a letter A in front of the word. So these are the two terms that stand in opposition, clean and unclean. Here we have cleansing action. Jesus cleansed, Jesus katharizo. But the whole passage never mentions unclean a single time. You will not find the word unclean in this whole passage. Instead, a completely different word is used, koinos. This word is very unique. In fact, the Old Testament never uses this word to talk about defilement or unclean or anything like that at all. The first place that we find anybody referencing this is in the Maccabees, in that period just before, after Malachi finished writing the last book of the Old Testament and before we have the writing of the New Testament. In that time period, there's a lot of upheaval, and we talked about how people expanded, the religious leaders expanded the concept of purity to include all kinds of additional elements. Here, for the first time, we find the word defiled. And it finds its own unique place. It's a third category. So in the Old Testament we talk about clean and unclean, but now we add something in between, and that is called defiled, koinos. What is this defiled category? Well, we already mentioned that unclean can refer to this existential idea, existential uncleanness, namely a pig. A pig is always unclean, whether it is washed, whether it is eating healthy food or unhealthy food. A pork or a pig is considered unclean for consumption. It is existentially that way. It cannot alter that state, no matter what you do. But there's a different state, and that is touch impurity. That is when you contract something. We talked about touching a corpse, and then you cleanse yourself from it, and that is touch impurity, and it comes and goes based on the washings and all of that. Well, in the Second Temple period, these two ideas were blended together into this koinos category, and that meant they considered, the Old Testament talks about first a pig is unclean and a sheep is clean, but in this intertestamental period, this period, they said, well, what happens if a sheep touches a pig? Well, let's not eat the sheep anymore. Maybe touch impurity has passed on to it. But that is not something that we ever find in the Old Testament. That does not happen. Consumption, yes, but not touch impurity. So here we have an extrapolation. And this category of a clean animal touching in this case, a unclean animal, a sheep touching a pig, now that sheep becomes defiled. That's what that category is. It is, for the Jews of the time, they would not consider it fit for food, and so they would leave that out. They would rather sacrifice a sheep that had not been contaminated by touch. Well, that's what they thought. Now, Jesus challenges exactly this in-between category, that defilement by touch transfers from this existential impurity. And he says, a pig is unclean, a sheep is clean, but that in-between category is something you made up. Don't add extra rules to what God already initiated. God's rules are sufficient. You don't need to add new rules to it. So, what is Jesus cleansing? He is removing that category. He says it's an invalid category. Stick to clean and unclean. Don't worry about defiled. That is something you made up. In essence, that's a summary of what Jesus is saying. And so Mark's interpretation, I think, here is absolutely correct. Jesus, with this little parable and then the ethical teaching at the end, says, no more of extra rules. Stick to what the Old Testament says. Clean and unclean is sufficient. Don't worry about defiled.
So what you're saying is that Jesus was really challenging the Pharisees on their understanding of purity.
Yes, Jesus completely turned the mindset of the religious leaders upside down. Not just by challenging their authority and the authority upon which they cite the tradition of the elders and referring back to the Word of God, but by actually even challenging this idea of defilement. And that is a radical reshifting, and it's an important reshifting. Because this had not just been applied to religious concepts or even to animals. This concept of separating and blending these different concepts of impurity was transferred to human beings as well. And this is where Jesus wants to extrapolate this whole idea himself. The whole concept, why the marketplace is so important in the opening lines, is because people had said everybody that is a non-Jew, everybody that does not follow these rules, is a threat to me. And Jesus says, don't worry about the other person as a threat. Worry about your own threat. Worry about your own heart. Not about the threat from outside, but the threat from inside. And this is why the whole passage begins with the outside, namely the marketplace, but ends with the heart, the inside. Worry about your heart and where your heart lies, and that you are in a right relationship with God, and that you are following what God has commanded you to do. Love your neighbor, love God, take care of other people, don't steal, don't do adultery, don't murder, be kind, and do justice. And this is a radical reshifting from matters of the heart rather than outside appearances. And the religious leaders were very concerned with outward appearances. And maybe that's something that we can learn even today, because it's so easy to only look at the outside and judge people and determine this is a holy or not holy, a pure or a not pure person. Jesus says it's actually the heart that determines whether you're pure or impure. That's where it all begins.
Dr. Mueller, thank you for this excellent explanation of the statement that Jesus purified or cleansed all foods. Jesus was rejecting the purity traditions of the Pharisees. He wasn't actually rejecting the Old Testament. So I invite you to join us for the final part of this conversation as we look at Mark 7 one last time. In that next episode, we'll be looking at how this applies to our own lives. Does it really have any application? And how does this passage fit in with Mark's overall gospel? It's going to be an excellent presentation, so I hope you can join us for that. Until then, Thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.